Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our webinar today about trauma-informed approaches, a guide to the resources. Our subject matter experts for today are from ICF International, so we're very thankful for their participation, talking about the resources from the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, as well as from their knowledge about trauma-informed care and building a trauma-informed approach in your agency. I did want to note that this webinar within our national webinar series is being sponsored by the Learning Communities Resource Center of the Community Action Partnership, and really our goal in LCRC is to focus on outcomes and innovative models to really get at the root causes of poverty. Our tagline in LCRC is really building the capacity of agencies and the network as a whole in order to fight poverty. Just to offer a framework for our series and for this specific webinar, in Community Action, we really are unified in our mission to fight poverty. And we also have a quote here from Chaplin on the next slide, which really just reminds us to keep focused, to really understand the need and then create our strategies that are going to have the most impact on meeting that need. I think trauma-informed approaches are incredibly relevant today in our work. We talk a lot about toxic stress and trauma that our clients face, so making sure that we have the best evidence to come up with innovative models to meet that need is incredibly important, which is why we're so excited for this webinar today. As I mentioned, this is part of our national webinar series. We hosted webinars in April as well as earlier this month, really touching on these topics of innovative models in fighting poverty through various approaches. We will be continuing this series throughout the life of the project. Like I said, really focusing in on various topics and approaches to fighting poverty. So hopefully you will stay tuned for the webinars that are coming up later this month. Those are available on our website, and I think we're going to give you the dates at the end of today. But really the goal of this series is to really understand new approaches and strategies, and also to highlight successes for strategies that are working, highlight local agencies' successes with different approaches and models and strategies, as well as really focusing in on resources and evidence that are available to show what works. Of course, we wanted to highlight the promise of community action, really to keep in mind why we do what we do and what our goals are, to really frame the context of our learning today, why we need these resources to really guide our strategies, how we're based in evidence, to really work with individuals but also communities as a whole to really help people help themselves and help each other. So with that being said, I'm thrilled to turn it over to ICF International. They have a plethora of knowledge around using evidence as well as specifically for trauma-informed approaches. Kristen Abner and Jessica Kendall both have extensive experience in this area, and so LCRC is excited to be working with them and to allow them to really share their knowledge with you all, as well as access to resources through the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. So hopefully they are unmuted, and I will be able to turn it over to them unless Tiffany Marley, our project director, has any additional comments to add before we get started.
Thank you, Natalie. I just want to echo the welcome to the network for participation in today's webinar and just the national webinar series itself. Our point and focus is very clear, and that is to help our network fight poverty more effectively. And we really feel that the focus on trauma-informed approaches and the other approaches highlighted by the Learning Communities Resource Center provides our network with an opportunity to kind of reframe the way we think about and engage in our anti-poverty strategies, and look forward to learning more about how trauma-informed approaches inform the way we provide services to our customers so that they can no longer experience that toxic stress and trauma, and also we seek to learn more about opportunities for agencies to be more trauma-informed in terms of its overall operations and structure as to not re-traumatize the very vulnerable families and individuals that are served on a daily basis. And so we are glad that you all have joined us, and we look forward to your engagement with the learning community as we go throughout this project. Thank you very much, Natalie.
All right, and with that, we will turn it over to Kristen Abner from ICF.
Thank you so much, Natalie and Tiffany. I really appreciate it, and Jesse and I are excited to be here. We want to welcome you all to this webinar on trauma-informed approaches. So I want to take a moment just to introduce myself, and then I'll have Jessica introduce herself. But I have to tell you that those are my kiddos on the left. I am not in the photo because, as you will see, I have a little baby, and it is very hard to be camera ready when you have an infant. So there you have it. You can see my beautiful kiddos instead of seeing my tired face. I am Kristen Abner. I completed my PhD in 2014 in sociology, and really what I tried to do in my dissertation was building knowledge around the role of the neighborhood and social support in child welfare involvement to help interventions be designed to not only target the family, but where they reside. I've served in a lot of capacities for projects here at ICF that focus on social programming for vulnerable families around TANF, child welfare, asset building, child care, and transportation. I work on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse that we're going to talk about today throughout our presentation. We have a resource library that I manage with tons of stuff up there on a variety of topics related to self-sufficiency. So really a goal on the project is to provide relevant resources for dissemination, really to practitioners, policymakers, and researchers. So I really hope that after this webinar, you'll be able to go to that website and get information on what you need. I'll share a little fun fact. You see from the picture, I have a almost 3-year-old daughter and a 6-month-old son, and they are best friends with my 90-pound Labradoodle, who is also not pictured. I am pretty sure that my son will be embarrassed later in life that I shared a naked picture of him, but I just couldn't resist. So I will then pass the mic to Jessie to introduce herself. She, you will see her goofy picture on the right. Jessie? Jessie, you're on mute if you're talking.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessie Kendall. I'm a senior technical specialist at ICF. I've been with ICF for about 2 years, where I work on a range of grant and contract projects with the federal government as well as with foundations that touch upon a lot of different areas relating to TANF, vulnerable children and families, disconnected youth, and individuals returning from the justice system. Prior to joining ICF, I was an attorney. I was practicing law. I represented children in child welfare proceedings. And as a part of that work, I did an extensive amount of training, mostly for lawyers and judges, on child welfare, but also juvenile justice best practices. And so I've had a lot of both, I guess, direct work exposure with folks who've experienced trauma, as well as sort of have had many opportunities to sort of delve into the literature and research on where the best sort of practices are. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about what some of those best practices are. In the way of a fun fact, because Kristen told me I should share one, is I'm a daughter of the American Revolution. On my dad's side, we have been in the States since before they were the States, in pre-revolutionary times. So again, looking forward to talking to you all, and I'll turn it back to you, Kristen, to get us started.
Thank you. So a roadmap of where we're going to go in the next hour or so. We'll start with an overview of our relationship with CAF, which has been going on for about 3 years. Then I'm going to give an overview of trauma-informed resources. And then I'm going to pass it to Jesse, who's really going to kind of tie everything together and give an overview of a trauma-informed framework that we put together based on the research. And those of you that have been on our webinars before know that we like to give tips for translation and implementation. So we'll wrap up with that and then provide additional resources. And if we have time, I'm hoping to give a little bit more overview of the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse that we've mentioned. So. We're going to answer questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to enter any questions in the chat box or in either the chat box or the Q&A box as they come up, and then we can address them at the end. So on to overview. So I'd like to start each of our webinars by telling everyone a little bit about our background with CAF. So this is a repeat of information for those of you that are joining us again. But this is part of our 3-year relationship with CAF. We've been partnering with the Learning Communities Resource Center for the past 3 years. We presented at CAP national meetings on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. Last year, we provided resources to 3 of the CAP cluster groups: place-based, family homelessness, and family financial capability. And last month, we presented on 2 Gen approaches. And next month, we're going to be presenting on bundled services. So we are excited to provide research and also giving you kind of that research to practice connection through this information. So as you heard from our bios, here at ICF, we do a lot of work around family self-sufficiency and technical assistance and training for programs serving low-income families. We run a few online clearinghouses, so you'll hear, again, Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, but also the National Resource Center for Healthy Marriage and Families, and the Office of Family Assistance Peer TA Network. So the SSRC, Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, it's really an ever-growing portal of research, and it's funded through the Administration for Children and Families Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. It really tries to be an online hub for professional networking among researchers, policymakers, and practitioners that are all doing this kind of work around family self-sufficiency. And we really aim to improve policy and practice in areas like employment, education, and training by giving you all access to field-tested, evidence-informed program strategies and high-quality research. So we have a team of folks that review any research that's going to go into our library to make sure that it is of sound quality and things like that. So you know that if something goes into the library, it's been reviewed by our experts here, so it doesn't have a fatal flaw and things like that. We make sure that the conclusions are backed up by the findings, things like that in our review. So today, our goal is to really talk to you about the research on trauma-informed care and really tie it to the community action context. So this slide shows our learning objectives, and our goal is to understand the state of the research and practice around trauma-informed care. And our second objective is to identify effective practices to improve in your own program. So it's our hope that this webinar will help you use these practices for your programs, coupled with the research base, to better serve the families that you work with. So I believe that the resource packet that we provided is online. And what we did was really try to pull out, okay, what is the state of the field on trauma-informed care? And so we have them grouped into 5 categories: background/need, trauma-informed care practices and organizational guides, secondary trauma, which we'll talk a little bit about what that means, serving children and youth, and then also serving special populations through a trauma-informed approach. We've provided the links to these resources if they're located on the SSRC or the OFA PRTA network. So if you click on one and it's in that library, you'll go to the SSRC page, which you'll see will provide a full abstract. It will give you the research methodology. If the resource specifically talks about a target population, it will give you that, and topic area information all at your fingertips. So moving on to a trauma-informed overview, and here we go for the video. So if you all will go to your multimedia tab, you will control it yourself to view this little short clip from Inside Out. And the reason we're showing this clip is to really kind of set the context here for, you know, thinking about how our early experiences shape who we are and how those experiences will affect us later in life and in the future. So I will give you 2 minutes to go to the media viewer and view the clip. Okay, so it's my understanding that you have to physically close or pause the video and close it out so it doesn't continue to play on your computer as you're listening to me, I think. Like I said, we wanted to kind of show that video just to really, you know, drive it home that these early experiences and trauma that children face, you know, they can build upon each other, and they're there, and they're part of how we should do our practice. So I will move on. Hopefully no one is hearing the video in the background as I'm talking, but please chat us if you are having technical difficulties. So what is trauma? So I'm going to use the definition from the American Psychological Association, who defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. And the APA also notes that immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical, but that longer-term reactions can include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms. So responses to trauma may occur shortly or long-term after an individual may experience a traumatic event. And really, it can vary based on the individual. So the understanding how childhood experiences shape who we are as adults can better support our understanding on how and why people do what they do. And Natalie mentioned toxic stress. So trauma is related to toxic stress. Many of you have heard that term, and I'll talk more a little bit about toxic stress here in a minute. So this slide shows the prevalence of trauma among adults and children in social service systems. So I'm going to kind of pause here for you all to take this in. So these are staggering statistics and probably not surprising, but for me, seeing them kind of quantified in this way really makes this an important issue, and really thinking about how to really integrate a trauma-informed approach into your work really is important based on these numbers. Okay, so more on prevalence. we wanted to highlight the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence. And if you haven't heard of it, it's a really unique study. It includes a representative sample of U.S. telephone numbers from August 2013 to April 2014. And via telephone interviews, information was obtained on 4,000 children ages 0 to 17 years old on information around exposure to violence, crime, and abuse. So in total, 37.3% of youth experienced a physical assault in the study year, and 9.3% of youth experienced an assault-related injury. 2% of girls experienced sexual assault or sexual abuse in the study year, while the rate was 4.6 for girls 14 to 17 years old. Overall, 15.2% of children and youth experienced maltreatment by a caregiver, including 5% who experienced physical abuse. In total, 5.8 witnessed an assault between parents. So really showing the reach of this and exposure to violence is very high among, you know, the population. There's a lot of really great resources coming out on this study, so I'd encourage you all to go to the study's website if you're interested in more information on it. So I mentioned toxic stress, and this is a graphic that we did as part of our work around healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood for the Office of Family Assistance. So you all may have heard the buzzword toxic stress, and we feel like it needs to be addressed in this conversation around trauma since they're related. And approaches on trauma-informed care are applicable here as well. So due to advances in medical, neurological, and social science, we know that significantly severe negative situations in childhood can elicit a toxic stress response and have the potential to permanently disadvantage and change a child's trajectory towards the kind of adult they will become due to really affecting the child's brain development and executive functioning skills. So our first question may be, okay, what is stress? So it's an individualized response to a situation that a person deems outside of their ability to address. So when we break it down, several aspects come to the forefront. So the first is that stressors are really individualized. So an event that may be stressful to one person may not be stressful to another. And this is important when we think about children, because children have fewer skills and cognitive capacity to deal with challenging situations compared to adults. So they may evaluate a situation like the inability to find their lovey at bedtime that adult could easily let slide. And the second thing here is that stress is a response, not an action. So people respond to stressors in three ways. They can fight, so confront the stressor, flight, get away from the stressor, or freeze, shut down. So while really any event can be a stressor for some individuals, not all stressful situations can be negative. So you'll see kind of in this first column here that we have, you know, tolerable or positive stressors. So meeting new people, starting a new job, school or daycare, things like that we may see as, you know, they build character, so to speak. Tolerable stressors, on the other hand, may be more severe. So the death of a loved one or a pet, a family divorce or move, experience an illness. So these may elicit a stronger stress response that may last for an extended time period. And then moving up, we have toxic stress. And this differs from tolerable stress in two ways. So stressors that engender a toxic stress response tend to be very severe, frequent, or long-lasting. And these can include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, persistent poverty, homelessness, or neglect. And these are likely to occur when a child experiences a dangerous, scary, or negative situation that's not buffered by the presence of a loving, caring adult. So a buffer can be provided by a parent, grandparent, caregiver, teacher. So these positive relationships can help mitigate the effects of toxic stress for a child. So again, while both children and adults experience stressors and have stress responses, only children can have a toxic stress response. And this is because toxic stress, by definition, is likely to shift the child's developmental trajectory. so they become a different adult than they otherwise would. So you can see how this relates to trauma for children. So on to our topic for the day. What is trauma-informed care? So it's an approach to social service delivery, and I want to quote, it's grounded in the understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma that emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers and survivors, and that creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. So it's rooted in the understanding of trauma to effectively respond and serve by taking into account the widespread impact of trauma, integrating knowledge of trauma into practice, avoiding re-traumatizing families, emphasizing safety for both clients and social service workers, and offering opportunities to heal, really. So it requires a shift in how an organization operates around organizational culture, values, and really day-to-day operations. So some social service organizations have begun adopting this trauma-informed care approach, taking into account how widespread the impact of trauma is among the folks you serve, recognizing signs and responding to integrate knowledge into practice. So being trauma-informed, it's really rooted in ecological theory. So ecological theory really considers the unit of analysis, so it's not one single individual, but it's a group of individuals and understands how they are embedded into physical and cultural areas of their surroundings. So children are embedded in families, who are embedded in organizations, who are embedded in neighborhoods. So thinking about organizations, CAP agencies, churches, schools. So organizations are an important target for conducting a trauma-informed care approach. So you can't just give the child support for previous trauma by talking to the child, but in order to have lasting impact, you may also serve the family and the organizational level. So I mentioned secondary trauma. We felt like it was really important to also mention secondary trauma in this context. You may also, burnout is another word for secondary trauma. So secondary trauma can be experienced by professionals working with traumatized adults and children. It results in staff turnover, burnout, and it can be really emotional working in this direct service line. So I want to mention a resource from ICF International. They compared secondary trauma to symptoms of PTSD. So it may cause staff to re-experience their own personal trauma, cause sleeplessness, guilt, anger, and fearfulness. So secondary trauma is an important component of a trauma-informed care approach. In thinking about how to best serve not only, folks that walk through your door, but also your staff. So moving on to key characteristics of a trauma-informed approach. I pulled these from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So according to SAMHSA, the concept of a trauma-informed approach realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the symptoms, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, practices, and procedures. So this is the component around, okay, what can we do around the organizational level that can really help serve families and children? And it also seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. So also from SAMHSA, the guiding principles behind a trauma-informed approach. So starting with safety, and this is really around both staff and clients, customers feel physically and psychologically safe in the environment. Trustworthiness and transparency. So decisions are made in an open environment, and really trust is built among everyone that walks through the door of the organization including staff, partner organizations, the families that walk through the door. Peer support and mutual self-help. So service delivery is built around these components, and obviously important for this building trust and establishing safety that I previously talked about. Collaboration and mutuality, this really is in relationships and sharing power and decision-making. And the organization considers everyone involved when making decisions. So I want to quote SAMHSA related to this. They say one does not have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So the organization really takes a strengths-based approach, not only with the folks you serve, but also with staff. So individualized service plans are developed based on the needs of the family and their support systems that they have. Finally, cultural, historical, and gender issues. Stereotypes and biases based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, geography are addressed, and service delivery is tailored based on these things. So this is back to that individualized service approach as well. So these are challenges to a trauma-informed approach that were built from a report from the Mick Silver Institute for Poverty Policy, and so they partnered with the National Council for Behavioral Health to facilitate a year-long learning community to help organizations adopt and sustain practices and principles of trauma-informed care. So a total of 32 organizations were enrolled, and these are the challenges that they identified. So senior leader buy-in, staff reluctance, lack of training to assess trauma, and then committing to a paradigm shift in organizational practices and policies. So with that being said, we'd like to hear from you all around what are some challenges that you face in implementing a trauma-informed approach. So I am not entirely sure how there we go. You'll see the poll. It's right on the right side of your screen. So I'll give you all a minute to answer the poll. So Natalie, will it show results of the poll in the window as well?
Yes. So once the poll closes in about 5 seconds, it'll take about 15 to 20 seconds to load, and it will show up on the right hand of your screen, and you can go ahead and read it out.
Okay, I don't see it yet. Okay, here we go. I'm not sure if everyone can see it, but I'll go ahead and read it. It looks like 36% of folks say lack of training to assess trauma is the biggest challenge. We then have 13% say all of the above, 8% say committing to a paradigm shift in organizational policies and practices, 8% say staff reluctance, 1% say senior leader buy-in, and then we had 4% say other, which I believe then we're going to be entered possibly in the chat box, but I do not see them. So we will move forward. Thank you for participating in that poll. Really interesting. I think it's great that senior leader buy-in seems to be the least challenging of these, which is really interesting, and I think really is good in order to move this forward in your organization. So I'm going to pass the ball to Jessie, who will pick up, and we have another video that she will give some context for and start with.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you, Jessie. This is Kristen.
Great. So is the video up? Because I'm not seeing it. Well, I can cue it up and talk about it for a moment. The video that you guys are about to see, it's a clip from a TED Talk by a gentleman by the name of Greg Boyle, who some of you might have heard of. He's the founder and CEO of Homeboy Industries, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, gang reentry program in the United States and headquartered in Los Angeles. And for about the last 25 to 30 years, Friar Boyle has been ushering young people and adults out of gangs and those returning from prison into workforce development programs that he runs through Homeboy Industries. Thousands of young people have shifted successfully from crime and from gang activity through his work. And the program is one that is heavy on case management, on soft skills attainment, on taking, although he doesn't use the terms, trauma-informed approaches, and building real job skills amongst the people that are participating through cafes, through plumbing organizations and other industries that he's created where he essentially hires people coming out of gangs. And so I wanted to just have folks watch 2 minutes of his TED Talk, and if you have time at a later time to watch the whole thing, I would really encourage you to do so because I think it really touches upon some of the foundations, the cornerstones of what it means to be trauma-informed across your organization. And so please, as the instructions say on the window, I'm hoping that folks can watch from about 1:20 to the 3:20 mark. Again, you guys control this, so you can start it now. So I hope that folks sort of are moved in the same way that I've been by Friar Boyle's words. At its core, it talks about that community or that circle of kinship that is so incredibly important when we think about trauma-informed approaches, and particularly that sort of paradigm or cultural shift that needs to occur in an organization in order for them to happen. Later in that video, the Friar talks about, and this really resonated with me particularly given the introductory slides that talked about anti-poverty strategies around seeking a compassion and a kinship with those who are poor that has us stand with them in awe of what they have to carry rather than standing in judgment of the way in which they carry it. And that principle really rings true when we think about trauma-informed care, building compassion and kinship and empathy that sort of sees no bounds between clients and staff and between and amongst staff at all levels. And so here at ICF, we work across a lot of different federal, state, and foundation contracts and grants that are really beginning to look at what trauma-informed care is, what trauma-specific interventions are, and some of the research that Kristen sort of gave us a primer on in the first 20 minutes of this presentation. And a lot of the systems that we work with touch youth, emerging adults, young adults, and adult population. And so looking across the sort of wealth of growing research on this topic, we started to think about a frame, a conceptual frame, that would meet the needs and the interests across our contracts, but also think about not just children, but adolescents and adults and staff across the agencies that we're working with. And so what you're looking at here is at a very high level, some of those beginning musings and thoughts that are really based in the research and the literature. And I want to highlight a couple things that it's based on. The first is the incredible work that SAMHSA has done on this topic and has been doing on this topic for, I think, 15 to 20 years in the substance abuse and behavioral health field. They really have a wealth of resources through their training and technical assistance centers that explains sort of their vision and the principles driving how they approach trauma-informed care that really inform the development of the frame that you're looking at right now. Another thing that has been really influential in our work is this line of growing research in brain science and epigenetics and stress, and particularly the effects that chronic stress has on, chronic stress and poverty have on executive skills. And Kristen mentioned this before, and those skills really relate to, in so many ways, how we think, how we interact with each other. They're sort of this cognitive self-regulatory skills that allow us to think organized, to use our working memory, to initiate tasks. And those capacities can really be challenged by chronic stressors, both in childhood and adolescence and adulthood, whether they were adverse experiences that happen in early childhood that are affecting the way our brain grows, or whether or not we're living in a chronically stressful environment that affects our current ability to, as I said before, think organized. And so that line of research really informs this frame as well. The other line of literature that I want to just note is sort of informing our work in this area is the literature and research around adult and child learning theory. That whole line of research that's that comes out of the education system that shows us how we best learn, how we best intake information, and then act upon it. So much about changing the culture in your organization around being trauma-informed relies upon training and interactions amongst staff, and then interactions between staff and clients. And a lot of how that interaction will come into play is really driven by what we know, what we've learned, and how we act upon that knowledge. And so this frame here really relies heavily on that learning theory, on that adult learning theory, and what we can infuse in our training to ensure that folks are taking in the information but also being able to act upon it. And so what I'm going to do is just walk quickly, or really in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, through each one of these pieces to talk about some tips around what they are and what you and your organizations can do to begin to implement them. So sort of a baseline thing that I think any organization needs to do in order to become trauma-informed is, of course, understand what the trauma is and how it affects people and how they interact with each other. And that goes, as Kristen was saying, both between staff and how trauma exposure might affect them, as well as your customers or your clients. And so that dissemination of knowledge through training, through experiential learning, is really quite a critical baseline before undertaking the other elements of a trauma-informed approach. And this is something that really requires an ongoing commitment of learning, because the literature base is ever growing in this area. 5 years ago, when folks talked about trauma or trauma-informed care, these concepts around toxic stress that Kristen was talking about weren't as prevalent. And so and particularly concepts around genetics and epigenetics were not a part of the conversation at that point. And so as the literature base grows, doing sort of ongoing training so that folks understand these terms, understand their effects on the people with whom they're interacting, and understanding how they relate to each other, because they are different concepts, as Kristen sort of alluded to, that trauma, toxic stress, executive functioning skills. There's a lot of sort of terminology out there that's important to understand how they relate to each other so that we can best act upon them. Following this increased understanding is a building of exactly what Friar Boyle was talking about, this building of kinship, of compassion, of empathy within an organization. And this is where sort of that culture shift really starts to occur. And it can happen in many ways, and there's just a couple examples on the slides there. Creating peer support opportunities and self-care opportunities for staff can be an incredibly important tool when thinking about building a sense of community amongst staff so that they feel empathy towards each other, and then that empathy sort of moves out to the margins, as Friar Boyle talked about, so that it's inclusive of everyone who's touching that organization, including your customers. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about an organization that's doing this also with their clients, where they've created peer support opportunity amongst former participants of their program and those coming in, so that they too can create community amongst themselves as well as community with the staff that they're interacting with. Following the sort of the beginnings of that building of empathy and culture shift in an organization is the importance of identification of trauma. Once you sort of know what it is and are able to empathize and build compassion around it, how and when do you identify it amongst each other, staff person to staff person, or supervisor to staff person, and amongst clients? And this is an area, and I saw it in the poll, where it's hardest to know what to do, and that struggle is reflective in what I've heard across organizations, particularly those that are just getting their feet wet on this topic and figuring out sort of what to do first. And what I've heard a lot from a range of organizations that include both TANF, child welfare, as well as reentry organizations and workforce ones, when we talked about the importance of identification, is we don't have the tools. We don't have the assessment tools, nor do we have the training for our staff to be able to identify trauma amongst our clients. And if we were to have those things, we don't have the resources to do anything about it once we find out that somebody's been traumatized. And so that is a real concern. And this is where this slide in particular, there's been, I think, a great variability in sort of different organizations' approaches when they think about what they can do now and what they might need to do later around becoming trauma-informed. And so I want to share that, you know, as Kristen's slides indicated, the prevalence of exposure to violence and trauma is very high amongst low-income, poor populations. And so realistically, in some ways, organizations that they touch are going to be dealing with some of the aftermath of those experiences in one way or the other. The level at which your organization decides to identify that trauma might be quite variable, whether you do a standardized trauma screening, appraisal, or full-on comprehensive assessment really will depend on your resources and capacity. But I would just want to suggest that, one, there are a lot of standardized tools out there on this topic. There's also a lot of training and TA that can be offered around this topic. Some of those tools, luckily, actually sit on SAMHSA's Trauma-Informed Care website, where they have a list of evidence-based tools on identifying trauma. And there are resources out there to help your organizations do this, and do this in a way that is competent and assures sort of the safety of both your staff and the people who are participating in the assessment, to avoid, as Kristen noted, that likelihood or the possibility of re-traumatization. The next sort of stage in the pyramid is around implementation. And what we mean by implementation is a couple-fold. When you think about a trauma-informed approach, you think about implementation in terms of enhancements or maybe changes to your current service delivery model. But you also think about shifts in policy and practice across the organization. And so a trauma-informed approach is different than a trauma-specific intervention. A trauma-informed approach is really an organizational change. It's sort of changing the way you do business across so many different facets, whereas a trauma-specific intervention is one that is sort of like a treatment modality, an intervention that is there to treat a specific individual who's experienced trauma. So an example of a trauma-specific intervention would be like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an evidence-based therapeutic model. I say that because the next couple slides around tips around implementation really sit in the trauma-informed space. They aren't around implementing a trauma-specific intervention. It's around a whole sort of organizational shift with specific foci on different sort of case management enhancements that your organization might consider. So the first, and I think pretty obvious, is the concept of building trust, real trust between a frontline caseworker and a customer. And one way to do that, particularly for somebody who's experienced trauma and sort of the lack of control and victimization, is setting clear and understandable expectations, not only of what you expect of them, but what they should expect of you. And what that might entail is both looking at sort of the different touch points at which you interact with a customer, both verbally or in person, as well as through written materials like brochures. and looking to see within, like, for example, the 4 corners of that brochure, whether or not it's easily digestible and sets out expectations on both sides, so that somebody who might not be as familiar with your program or what it has to offer or your expectations would understand sort of their role and responsibilities as well as yours. The next piece on supporting collaboration, at first blush might sound like we're talking about collaborating with other entities. In this instance, we're not. We're talking about collaborating with your customer or client in a way that gives them opportunities, even if small ones, to be truly engaged in the case planning process and other decisions that affect them. For those who feel sort of disenfranchised or disempowered, these sort of small offerings to give them some control over the trajectory of their time with your program can really make a difference in not only building trust, but giving them ownership in such a way that increases the likelihood that they will successfully complete your program. So the next 2 pieces, the first in particular is around goal setting. Having worked in child welfare for some time and having sat in on a lot of service plan meetings, and particularly around when we talked about goals, I don't recall very often, I'm sorry to say, that the goals were ever really tailored to what the client or the customer was actually interested in achieving. The goal might have been complete this parenting class, go get your driver's license, go do this, do that, do this. And at no point in most of those meetings do I ever recall a conversation around what the individual, whether it's a parent or a young person, what their goals were. And so understanding that there are certain things that have to happen in order for someone to move through a program, wrapping those expectations in goals that are of interest and achievable for your client can make a world of difference when it comes to them actually successfully completing your program and then moving on to what hopefully is self-sufficiency. And particularly given this line of research around executive skills and deficits, taking those goals that are tailored really to the individual and what they want, and being able to break down the steps in ways that are digestible and organized can really make a difference. So for somebody who's living in a chronic state of sort of stress, being able to think organized and organize what they need to do when can be a difficult task. And so setting those goals that are achievable and stepped, and as the next part of that slide talks about, modeled by a caseworker, can really make a difference in sort of empowering a client who might have executive skill deficits to learn those skills, because they are learnable. Finally, a case plan should never be a static document. They should be live documents that acknowledge the fact that many of our clients need flexibility in them and that circumstances change, and so should case plans. Sort of at the core of being trauma-informed is obviously understanding what trauma is and how it affects those with whom we work and those who we are working for. And there has to be, with any sort of best practice, I would suspect, some flexibility and understanding that as their circumstances change, we need to pivot as well in order to ultimately ensure their success. So I want to share just a couple examples sort of from the field of organizations and entities that are sort of doing this work at varying levels. And the first is Frontiers of Innovation, which is an initiative that's being supported out of Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which has a wealth, I mean really a wealth of research and literature on toxic stress and executive skills, mostly focused on children, but they do have some things also affecting adults. The Frontiers of Innovation project is sort of a pilot project across several different sites. Washington State and Connecticut are two of them that come to mind, that are sort of incorporating the research around brain development and toxic stress into different sort of service delivery strategies and taking sort of a trauma-informed approach along the way. And so Washington State, I think, has 6 pilots through their state-level Department of Early Learning, where they're providing interventions to both parents and young children that sort of builds parents' capacity to understand executive skills and sort of not only in themselves but in their children to sort of improve the parent-child relationship. The Connecticut program is called New Haven Moms, and MOMS stands for Mental Health Outreach for Mothers. And they're studying the effects of combining basic services for low-income mothers, like supplying diapers, for example, with different stress management interventions. And part of their structure includes, and this is where the empathy piece comes in, sort of the community mental health ambassadors, where they have alumni neighborhood moms who get trained as outreach workers to promote health and development and achievement among the families that are currently being served by the project. Another example I want to call out, in part because they have also a lot of great literature on their website on their approach, is the Crittenden Women's Union. And they're out of Massachusetts. And you can see there, it's a little hard to see because it's so small, but this is their bridge to self-sufficiency, which sort of represents their theory of change that takes a pretty iterative, multifaceted approach to promoting economic mobility among low-income clients, mostly women that they serve. And the theory is that a person sort of moves to self-sufficiency as they move across the different pillars of the bridge that you see. And those pillars relate to family stability and well-being and education and training. And the path through each pillar of the bridge, the customer has to meet certain benchmarks relating to well-being and health and behavioral issues that may otherwise be preventing them from becoming economically mobile and self-sufficient. And a key to the bridge model is what you can see at the top of the bridge. It says mobility mentoring. And that's sort of the Crittenden's approach to case management, which they refer more to as a mentoring or a coaching model that really creates partnerships between staff and customers, where the staff really model sort of best practices around executive skill capacities to their clients, so that the client then acquires the resources and the knowledge and the skills so that they can attain and, importantly, maintain their economic self-sufficiency after the program's done. So I would encourage folks to get on Harvard's website as well as Crittenden's if you haven't heard of these programs, and pull some of the literature on how they're doing this in their community. So over the last hour and 10 minutes or so, Kristen and I have obviously shared a lot of information with you that draws from a lot of different sources. And so it can feel a little overwhelming, and I wanted to just end my piece of the webinar by just identifying a couple different sort of tools that you can use as you start to think about how and when and whether you might start to take a trauma-informed approach in your organization. And so these aren't really trauma-informed specific, but they're tools that we've used, particularly providing training in TA to federal grantees to help them sort of move the needle or affect some change in their organizations. So this first slide really touches on the different stages of implementation science. And I won't go into it in any great detail except to say that what you're looking at here is different stages that organizations take when they want to change something at sort of a global level within their organization, but also to affect change with a particular practice. A key takeaway from this is that change, particularly when it relates to a complex social problem like trauma and exposure to violence, is one that takes time. And so you can see at the bottom of the graphic, the research around implementation science suggests that really 2 to 4 years is a logical and fair time frame within which an organization can affect a real sort of substantial change in the way that they do their work. But walking through these different stages, from exploring the idea, from learning about it, from attending webinars like this one and looking at the resource packet that's been provided, to beginning to consider how you might affect that change in your organization, to maybe testing it on a small scale through an initial implementation or a pilot to sort of make course corrections and identify weakness areas or where your strengths may be, and then seeing ways in which you can scale is a research-informed, it's an evidence-based sort of approach to affecting a change like the one we're talking about. Another frame to consider when you're thinking about trauma-informed approaches is that, as I said before, the concepts around trauma and exposure to violence are ones that really touch on very complex social and community issues. And so an organization can't always address those issues amongst their customers alone. And so what you're looking at here is a frame that relates to a concept called collective impact. And the point of it is, when you have a complex problem, it takes multiple entities to address it together in order to actually resolve it. And to do that requires that there be an organization that sort of leads the charge, that backbone organization you can see at the bottom of the triangle. And that backbone organization will help set and identify a common agenda amongst community stakeholders that also are touching that issue, so that they all can work sort of in parallel process, but also collaboratively to address the problem together. And so there's a great amount of literature that's growing on this concept of collective impact, and I'd suggest that if folks are interested, they look on the Aspen Institute's website, as well as FSG and Stanford's Social Service Review, all of which have great articles that sort of explain this approach and how to implement it. This last slide here, well, it is what it looks like. It's a logic model. I know that makes probably some people cringe, but when we think about trauma-informed care, and you're wondering, you know, where do I really start? I would suggest that this is a great place to start. Sitting down and thinking about what it is that you want to achieve, thinking about the problem that you want to address and really defining it, and also defining what your solution is, as well as the outcomes you hope to achieve, and doing so as an organization, and even including clients in that conversation as sort of a beginning point to think about what your organization's approach will be to trauma-informed care. And in addition to helping sort of organize at an institutional level, you're thinking about how you'd want to approach this. It also starts to build your capacity for evaluation later. So if and when your organization decides they want to assess and evaluate the extent to which your trauma-informed approach is working, this logic model provides a real important backbone for what it is that you might want to test later on. So thank you all for your time. I'm going to turn things over now to Kristen, who's going to share a couple additional resources from the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. And you have to pass me the ball, I think, so I can advance the slides. There you go. Thank you. So I am putting the website into the chat box for folks to be able to get to the SSRC. I'm going to really quickly go through this in the interest of time. So the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, it's federally funded through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Office of Research Planning and Evaluation. And ICF is leading this effort with help from Child Trends, the Urban Institute, and the Same Group. We went through a pretty significant design phase, really trying to think about what does the field need and what does it mean to be self-sufficient. So you'll see that we've organized the repository around these 12 topic areas. So resources to get into the library, they have to be related to one of these 12 topic areas, and they have to be related to self-sufficiency. So, for example, you'll see child care is on here. So you may see a resource on child care quality, but in order for the resource on child care quality to make it into our library, it has to be related to how child care quality helps improve self-sufficiency for families. So we really, really try to stay relevant and really specifically focus on self-sufficiency here. Let's see. So how can you use the SSRC? If you go to our research library, you can search for research in the library. What I really like about our library is you can search for what you need in multiple ways. So you can certainly type in a word in the keyword box, but on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll notice that we have lots of different facets, we call them. So you can search for a randomized control trial in methodology, and you can also search for, you can tailor it to certain years. You can search for really specific, what we like to call popular search terms, you know, SNAP, Medicaid, things like that. We also have topical pages that provide research, relevant new research if you don't want to dig through the library for a bunch of things. We have a calendar of events. We have information on how to understand and use data. And if you listened to one of our ICF webinars with Kat before, you know, we talk a lot about understanding data and how to use it in your own practice. We have a data sets compendium if you are so inclined to pull data and do some analysis and understand what's going on nationally trend-wise. We have a lot of national data sets that we link to through our website. So to wrap up, like I said, if you've joined us before, we like to end with kind of really key things to leave you with. You know, we've given you a lot of information, but here's just 4 things in order to move forward. So understand what it means to have a trauma-informed approach. Hopefully this webinar helps build that understanding. Really conduct a scan of your existing policies and practices with a trauma-informed lens. Make your plan using a scary logic model if you're so inclined. And then really thinking about using a collective impact approach to address larger community trauma. So really thinking about that ecological model, you know, neighborhoods, organizations, you know, children and families embedded within those, and how can we kind of think big picture about reducing trauma in the community. So, shameless plug, I will be presenting with my colleague Courtney Barthel on bundling services in June, so I'm looking forward to that presentation, and I want to encourage you all to attend if you're interested in learning more about the state of the field in bundling services. I want to thank you for your attention, and at this time, I think we will take questions.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to you both, and thank you for everybody attending today. I just really appreciate how you all laid out this webinar, really starting with the statistics, showing that trauma-informed approaches are really relevant. I like the ecological model to really give context to this issue and context to clients within the community. We really have been trying to stress that our sort of strategy with this topic is around a trauma-informed approach instead of services. So I thank you again for touching on the difference there. I also really liked your implementation slide that really showing that this takes time. We are working with a smaller group of agencies on creating goal plans around creating a trauma-informed approach. So it's always a good reminder that things like this take time, that it really is about a culture shift. And then lastly, with that collective impact piece, community action is really moving into an intense conversation about community level impact and collective impact models to make that happen. So appreciate that as well. A couple of the questions that we got were pretty general, really about how to get started on doing this, but I think the deeper that you all got into the tools that are available and using a logic model answer some of those questions. We did, another question just came in about, you know, secondary trauma tips for working with clients who may have been re-traumatized by another agency, whether that be another satellite site of your agency or agency that you all partner with. If you all have any thoughts on that or resources that may be available for, you know, working with clients that have experienced that issue.
This is Jessie. You know, the concept around re-traumatization is an incredibly important one and a careful one, particularly if a program is undertaking a more sort of, I think, comprehensive identification and assessment process to identify trauma. Because certainly, particularly when you're dealing with young people and children, just the act of asking the questions can in and of itself re-traumatize. So having a ton of training around how to ask those questions and when is very important. And I would suggest that for folks looking for more resources on that, that there's the Children's Bureau has a website called the Child Welfare Information Gateway that has a slew of materials on secondary trauma as well as trauma-informed care and re-traumatization, because it's such a huge issue for children and young people who are entering into the foster care system, who've been abused or neglected, and who oftentimes, unfortunately, move from foster home to foster home and school to school. And so there's a lot of literature in the child welfare world, and actually also juvenile justice as well, around re-traumatization and sort of avoiding as much as possible those things. Some of them are things that you can do in your own practices as you're sort of talking and interacting with people, but obviously there's systemic changes that can also can occur that might decrease, for example, in child welfare, the movement of kids from school to school or foster home to foster home.
And I'll just add to that, this is Kristen, you know, thinking, you know, we're talking about big picture, and you know, once you start doing this in your organization, it really, you know, the folks you were working with, the family you're working with, touch multiple organizations. So I would say really, you know, getting other organizations on board with the approach really would help reduce that obvious re-traumatization. So, you know, a partner meeting and sharing information and you know, doing a joint training for staff across multiple organizations would be helpful as well.
So in thinking about working with other organizations to really make this a community level issue, wondering if you all have any thoughts about outcomes, so how you would measure the change within your agency, but also if you are working with other agencies, how you can measure a change in trauma-informed approaches in your community.
So I think what I've seen logic models that focus on affecting change around trauma-informed care, I've seen folks sort of break down their outcomes by an individual level, meaning the client, the customer who we're hoping to serve, and how it might change their trajectory through our program or programs if we're working collectively, and then focusing on outcomes on the organization itself that sort of break down into policies, practices, training, and sort of staff competencies. And then like you're alluding to, the third sort of outcome area often, and there is great variability here, relate to sort of community trauma-informed care. And really, it's hard to give you exact examples of what that might look like. To be honest, it's quite variable, and it depends on who your partner organizations are. And one of the key components of that collective impact frame is finding those common goals and missions and aligning them in such a way that you can look across the outcomes that each of your organizations seek to achieve and finding some synergy between them in a way that would take sort of a trauma-informed lens. So I don't want to punt on the question. At the same time, the variability is so great depending on who the different players are in your community that you want to touch, that it might change.
Great, thanks. I mean, I think that's fair. So, but just really, thinking about how to plan for your outcomes so that you can evaluate, whether you're meeting that need, and especially after working with multiple organizations. But like you said, it will be different based on the approach that is taken. So one last question before we give some announcements, just really thinking tangibly, you talked about some tools for, identifying areas in your agency that may need to be addressed or modified, and then also in thinking about modifying your policies and procedures. Just wondering if you all had any recommendations for tools or templates for altering policies and also intake forms that you all may have that are existing in the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse or maybe somewhere else.
So if you go to the packet, there's a whole category on practice and organizational guides. I don't want to read them, but there's frameworks for building your organization and kind of where to start. There's a really, really great toolkit there from the National Center on Family Homelessness that really gives a roadmap for how to do this. So I would really suggest going to the packet and pulling out those these practice and organizational toolkits. They're a really great place to start. There's a self-assessment and it's specifically for child abuse prevention agencies, but I think it could be used in this context as well, to really do an organizational assessment to understand, okay, where do we need to make changes? Jesse, do you have anything to add there?
The one thing that I do want to mention when we think about sort of practical tools in this area that we didn't mention during the presentation portion is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, particularly if your organization is working with children or adolescents. The network, which is also funded by SAMHSA and run, I think, by Duke University and UCLA, I think, has a really incredible amount of literature and practical tools for community and other organizations to become trauma-informed and also to provide trauma-specific intervention. And so I'd encourage folks to visit that website as well when you're looking for practical tools.
Great, thanks. People should be able to see on the screen right now. We did release this brief in collaboration with ICF that includes all the resources. So this resource packet is available now on the partnership's website under the Learning Community Resource Center. It's also available on the CSBG TTA Resource Center, and hopefully you can click on this slide right now to access that PDF. It's also, I believe that Tiffany Marley, the project director, sent it through the chat window at the beginning of this webinar. Of course, we are recording this webinar. We will be sharing the recording, the slides, and the resource packet after we get everything downloaded and then uploaded to our website. So likely by the end of the week, you all will be receiving that. Just a few other reminders here. We did host a webinar, I believe it was in December, with our subject matter expert of the Trauma-Informed Approaches Learning Community Group, Elena Cohen. So that recording is available on the website as well as the slides, which provides, some more in-depth detail into trauma-informed approaches, some resources, and of course makes that community action specific. Our learning community group is continuing, so we will continue to be sharing resources and products from that specific group. I also wanted to note ICF is doing a webinar next month on bundling services, so utilizing a similar model of infusing statistics and research and creating an approach and a model. They will be talking about bundling services next month. That webinar is free, and registration is available here and also on our website. We do have an open group regarding family homelessness, so they are having their second webinar in June. That is hosted by the National Alliance to End Homelessness, so hopefully you will be able to join us for that webinar, and the recording from the first one is also available on our website as well. Similarly, we have our National Poverty Trends Open Group, which is having its second meeting in June, which really is getting into discussing the causes and conditions of poverty to look at the numbers behind the reality of poverty and the policies that will or should be accompanying these issues. This is the contact information for the TNTA and LCRC team here at the partnership. If you have any questions about today's webinar or the upcoming webinars or any issues in general, just want to again say thank you so much to Kristen Abner and Jessica Kendall for your insight today. Thank you all again for joining this webinar, and we will be in touch shortly with the recording and the slides and the resource packet. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and of course a shameless plug for our conference this August in Austin, Texas. Thanks so much.